The morning had broken slow and heavy over the desert valley, casting long shadows across the parched earth and whispering wind through the brittle thorns of the acacia trees. Sergeant Wallace Wally Grant, age 58, lay prone beneath a dense bush of tamarisk, the sharp branches clawing at his sweat-soaked uniform and the earth beneath him as warm and dry as an oven's breath. The years had carved deep lines into his face, and his once black hair had faded to iron gray, cropped short beneath his helmet, but his eyes, those steel-blue eyes, still cut like razors, sharp and alert, scanning the shifting dust behind him where the boots of the enemy patrol had just passed. He pressed his cheek to the sand, feeling the tremble of footsteps slowly fade and watching with narrowed focus the silhouettes of 5 insurgents fading into the haze. He'd outlived 2 wars, raised 3 kids alone after his wife passed in '98, and now found himself back in combat as a civilian volunteer in the so-called Free States conflict, an ugly, sprawling fight that had choked the region with smoke and ruin for years now. When the younger recon unit he'd been embedded with had been ambushed at the ridge and scattered, Wally had crawled through bramble and stone, dragging with him only a flask of water, an old sidearm with 2 rounds, and the weather-beaten radio clamped to his chest like a talisman. He didn't panic. He hadn't panicked since Tet. When the rest of his team had tried to flee downhill toward friendly territory, he'd gone sideways, flanking the enemy path instead. And now here he was, buried like a scorpion in the shade of thorned bush, silent and unseen, listening to the coughs and distant shouts of the enemies as they swept the ridges behind him. From this position, he could see the base, the enemy compound tucked just beneath a sand-burnished cliff, its outer wall broken by erosion and poor construction. That was his real goal. They had taken one of the American contractors, a drone technician named Harris, along with 2 native Allied soldiers, when they struck the forward outpost 2 days earlier. Intelligence said the compound might house an uplink tower used for coordinating drone swarms, a tactical nerve center. Destroying it or disabling it could turn the tide of the campaign. But the brass had deemed it too risky, too well defended, and had pulled resources elsewhere. Wally thought otherwise. The base was only accessible on foot through the northern cliff trail or by direct assault, which meant most believed it untouchable. But he'd seen the water runnels in the gulch, remembered from a geology trip with his youngest son 20 years ago, and recalled that water dug paths where man never looked. He had a plan, but first he had to survive the next few hours. He adjusted slowly, moving no more than a breath's width, letting the cover of rustling wind shield the faint creak of his belt. The sun rose higher, the heat baking his back even through layers of gear. Flies buzzed around his neck. The sharp scent of sweat mixed with the dust and dry rot of the bush's interior. He could hear the hum of a distant drone circling, though its shadow hadn't passed nearby yet. He needed to wait. Move too soon and he'd end up a stain on the rocks. He drank a sip from the flask, just enough to wet his cracked lips, and remembered something his father once told him after a tornado hit their farmhouse in 1957, "A storm don't care how loud you scream, but it listens when you're still." That memory calmed his breath. Below the ridge, a faint rustle caught his ear. A goat wandered near the base, bleeding, its shepherd hidden out of sight, likely unaware of the war humming beneath the dust. Wally wondered if he'd make it back to the States this time, if his kids would ever understand why he kept volunteering, even at his age. He'd tell them it was duty, but the truth ran deeper. He didn't know how to stop. When the ambush first came, and the younger men shouted and scrambled like panicked deer, he'd felt the old instincts take hold, not with fear but with cold, sharp clarity. He was made for these moments. But clarity didn't mean comfort. His knees ached, his back throbbed from the crawl, and every breath through the scarf tied over his mouth tasted of dust and regret. Still, he endured. The patrol looped back once, the youngest of them, barely out of his teens by the look, pausing near the bush to light a cigarette, the acrid scent curling through the leaves and making Wally's nose twitch. He didn't move. Not even when ash drifted down to land near his boot. Not even when a radio squawked in the man's hand and he barked a reply. After an eternity, they moved on. Wally's fingers were numb from the tension, but his mind sharpened with the narrowing of time. The compound's defenses were lighter on the eastern edge. He could use the natural rock formations to cover his approach. But first he had to reach the gulch, 500 yards of open terrain and barely a tree to hide behind. He would wait for dusk. The shadows would be his allies. He shifted again and cursed softly at the sudden spasm in his hip, but bit down the pain. Around midday, a friendly drone buzzed far overhead. He recognized the pitch of its engine and hoped it meant HQ was still tracking heat signatures. Maybe they'd see him. Maybe not. He didn't count on it. He'd been forgotten before. A buzzard circled lazily high above, its wings casting a brief flicker across the bush's interior. Wally blinked, then adjusted his watch. 4 more hours until sunset. He spent the time listening, remembering every noise, every wind shift. The enemy wasn't in a hurry. They believed the fight was already won. That arrogance would be their undoing. By late afternoon, the wind had picked up, carrying grit that scoured his face raw. He wrapped a scrap of cloth across his eyes for a few minutes at a time to rest them, taking care not to fall asleep. He thought of Harris again, 27, awkward, bookish, with glasses so thick they looked bulletproof. Wally had spoken to him once in the mess tent, laughing at how the kid could rebuild a drone blindfolded but couldn't boil an egg. They'd shared a joke about coffee, the way it always tasted like burnt tires out here. He owed the kid a chance. He owed himself that much too. Finally, as the sky turned bruised purple and shadows grew long across the plain, Wally slid from beneath the bush like a ghost, every move deliberate, his boots barely kissing the ground. He moved low, belly to sand, using the wind to muffle the sound. He passed the last trail marker, ducked beneath a ridge of broken sandstone, and reached the mouth of the gulch just as the last rays of light vanished. He paused there, pressed to the rock, heart pounding, listening to the murmur of voices echoing faintly from the compound above. The scent of cooking fires and oil drifted down. A dog barked in the distance. He was close now. He would wait here until full dark, then climb. His plan was half instinct, half madness, but it was his. And if he reached that uplink, if he could bring it down, the enemy would lose their eyes. The fight might tilt. The war might slow. Darkness spread across the canyon like ink spilled over sand, and Wally waited until the last glint of twilight vanished before moving again. His body aching but his mind steady, locked on the jagged wall of the gulch ahead. He took a deep breath, tasting the soot and campfire smoke drifting down from the enemy base, and began to climb, pressing his fingers into stone worn smooth by centuries of wind and grit. Each foothold a gamble on muscle memory and stubborn will. He didn't rush. He climbed like a man who had climbed before, who knew that patience saved lives and mistakes left bodies. The rock face was pockmarked enough to give him leverage, and he reached a small ledge halfway up where he crouched low, listening to the faint chatter of guards above, their voices muffled by the hiss of wind through broken antennas. From here, he could see more of the base. Corrugated metal huts, a communications dish, a line of fuel drums stacked carelessly near the wall, and near the center, a steel tower bristling with cables and blinking red lights, the uplink, no doubt. The tower was the brain of this outpost, its signals coordinating drone strikes and intel relays across the region, making it a high-value target no one had dared approach until now. Wally scanned the perimeter again. 2 guards on rotation, moving slowly, distracted, overconfident. He checked his watch. 5 hours until first light. He had time. Carefully, he removed the small canvas pouch strapped to his thigh and opened it, revealing the contents: a folded map, a crumpled cigarette he kept for luck, and an old field toolkit, tools worn smooth by decades of use. They'd laughed at him back at HQ when he carried it on the transport. A relic, they called it, but he knew its value. He'd used this kit to fix radios in the jungles of Vietnam, patch up tanks in Iraq, and now, maybe, dismantle the heart of an enemy stronghold. He unfolded the map, squinting in the dim light, recalling the layout he'd memorized. There was a maintenance hatch on the far eastern wall, likely forgotten beneath a stack of crates. If he could get to it, he could enter the compound without alerting the guards. He repacked the kit, slung it over his shoulder, and resumed his climb. The final stretch to the cliff's edge was steeper, and twice he slipped, stones rattling down into the shadows below, but no alarms were raised. By the time he rolled over the edge and into the rear slope of the enemy base, he was covered in dust and sweat, chest heaving, heart thundering in his ears. He lay still for several minutes, letting the adrenaline ebb, watching the guards' patterns. Then, crouched low, he moved along the edge of the compound, keeping to the shadows. He found the hatch exactly where he'd hoped, rusted, half covered in debris, its bolts barely intact. He worked quickly, silently, loosening the frame with a flat tool, the scrape of metal barely audible over the hum of generators. After 10 tense minutes, the hatch gave, and he slipped inside, landing in a storage corridor that smelled of oil and mildew. The corridor led to a series of maintenance rooms, dark, narrow, deserted. He paused behind a stack of crates and listened, footsteps above, a muffled cough, then silence. He moved on, passing an empty barracks room where a single cot still held a sleeping figure, boots kicked off carelessly nearby. Wally kept moving, remembering every turn, every shadow. In a supply closet, he found what he needed, an old jerrycan half full of fuel and a length of detonation cord likely forgotten during a transfer. He tucked them into his bag, careful to balance the weight, and headed toward the central tower. But halfway there, near a communications room, he heard voices, 2 enemy officers arguing in clipped tones, one angry, the other amused. Wally couldn't understand the language, but he read body language like a book. The angry one gestured toward a map on the wall, stabbing it repeatedly, while the other laughed and waved him off. Wally leaned closer and noticed something startling on the map, a marked circle around a nearby village, with symbols indicating a drone strike scheduled for sunrise. Civilians. Dozens, maybe more. His blood ran cold. This wasn't just about Harris or the uplink anymore. He had to stop that signal. He backed away slowly and moved toward the base of the tower. It was a squat structure of steel and composite, held together with bolts and wires, humming with data and life. Wally circled it, found a rear access panel, and got to work. He used the det cord to rig a charge beneath the panel, careful to hide it behind a stack of crates. Then he poured a thin trail of fuel toward a bundle of communication relays, soaked a rag in the remaining fuel, and tucked it beneath a vent near the tower's intake. The plan was simple. One spark would trigger the rag, the fire would follow the fuel trail to the cord, and the explosion would cripple the uplink without leveling the base. It wasn't perfect, but it was surgical, quiet until it wasn't. He had to time it right. As he finished, he heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, too controlled for a guard. He ducked behind a crate and watched as a man in civilian clothes crept into view, Harris. The kid looked rough, his face bruised, glasses cracked, but he was alive and alone. Wally hissed to get his attention, and Harris froze, then turned slowly, disbelief blooming across his face. Wally motioned him over. They embraced briefly, silently, then ducked together behind the crates. Harris explained in a whisper, he'd escaped when his captors got drunk and careless, and was looking for a radio to call for help. Wally smiled grimly. "I've got a better idea," he said, handing Harris a flare pistol he'd swiped earlier. "You're going to signal when the fire starts. Aim high. Real high." Harris nodded. Wally led him back toward the supply room, where they'd hole up until the moment came. They sat in the dark, the minutes crawling, the weight of silence pressing down like a mountain. Wally thought of his daughter, the way she used to braid his hair when she was small, and his son, who once asked him why people fought wars. He had no good answer then. He still didn't. But he knew why he was here, because someone had to be. At 4:17 a.m., he crept back to the tower, ignited the rag, and ran. The fire caught slowly, a flicker, then a dance, then a furious hiss as it met the fuel and raced toward the charge. He reached Harris just as the explosion tore through the night. Sharp, focused, deafening. The tower's top shuddered, lights blinked, and alarms began to wail. Guards shouted, scrambled, ran for weapons. And that's when Harris stepped into the courtyard and fired the flare. It soared into the sky, a streak of red against the black, a signal not just to friendlies, but a message to the enemy. You've been breached. From the ridge beyond, Wally hoped someone was watching. He didn't need credit. He needed time. And now they had it. The base was in chaos. The plan had worked. But it wasn't over yet. Not even close. The flare hung in the sky like a blood-red eye, casting eerie shadows across the compound as panic rippled through the enemy ranks, men shouting in confusion, boots slamming into gravel, floodlights flickering on in a stuttering rhythm as if even the machines were startled. Wally didn't wait for the smoke to settle. He grabbed Harris by the sleeve and pulled him down a side corridor just as the first round of return fire began cracking through the base, bullets ricocheting off metal siding and sparking showers of flame near the ruined tower, where cables now hung loose like snapped tendons, spewing arcs of dying electricity into the air. The fire from the detonation had spread, licking its way up the fuel drums, and with each passing second the noise grew louder, more chaotic, like a storm rising from beneath the earth, and Wally knew that was his only chance, to ride that confusion straight through the heart of the base before the enemy could regroup and lock the place down. They passed 2 stunned guards near the mess hall who barely had time to raise their rifles before Wally fired, not with a gun. He'd left that behind, but with a smoke canister he'd yanked from a supply shelf, sending a cloud of choking gray mist into the hallway and masking their movement as they ducked into the vehicle bay. Inside, under the harsh strobe of emergency lights, sat an old recon jeep, dusty and half-covered by a tarp, its keys dangling from the ignition as though fate itself had set the stage. Wally pushed Harris toward the passenger seat and jumped behind the wheel, twisting the key and praying the engine still had some life in it. The motor coughed once, twice, then roared to life with a deep growl that reverberated through the garage, drawing fresh shouts from outside. He slammed it into gear and shot through the half-open loading door, bursting into the open yard as guards spun around. Too late to react, their bullets pinging uselessly off the back quarter panel as the jeep sped toward the outer wall. The main gate was still shut, steel and reinforced, but Wally didn't head for the gate. He veered right, toward the breach he'd seen earlier near the crumbling eastern wall, a section partially collapsed from erosion, just wide enough for a daring escape if you didn't mind a few scrapes. He floored it, engine howling, wind tearing at their faces, and Harris braced himself as the jeep leapt over debris and slammed through the gap with a crunch of metal and rock, the suspension shrieking as it landed hard on the slope beyond. They were out. For now. Wally didn't stop. He aimed for the dry riverbed that led through the canyon, navigating by memory and moonlight, adrenaline drowning out every ache and warning in his aging body. His hands steady on the wheel as they bounced and skidded through the dust and rock, the sky behind them lit by the burning flare and the rising column of smoke from the ruined tower. After 15 minutes, when no pursuit followed, he finally slowed near an outcrop of black stone and cut the engine. Silence fell, thick and total. Harris exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for hours and looked at Wally, eyes wide behind cracked lenses. "You're insane," he whispered. Wally smiled, his face lined with exhaustion and satisfaction. "Old age and treachery," he said, "beats fancy tech any day." But there was still one thing left to do. He reached for the radio unit clipped to his belt, flipped the switch, and prayed the blast hadn't fried the signal. A burst of static answered, then a faint voice, American, frantic, then clearer as he tuned the frequency. "This is Eagle 9 requesting verification. Who lit the flare?" Wally keyed the mic. "Grayback actual," he said, using his long-retired call sign. "Uplink neutralized. Repeat, target is down. Enemy command blind. Request extraction at Delta Point, 2 souls." The silence that followed was brief but thick with disbelief. Then, "Copy that, Grayback. Bird en route. A-20. Wally leaned back against the seat, closed his eyes, and let the wind play across his face, every breath filled with the scent of dust, burnt wiring, and survival. But the silence didn't last. A sound, soft, rhythmic, echoed from the canyon rim. He tensed. Harris raised his head, eyes darting toward the rocks. Shadows moved, figures emerging, weapons in hand. Not guards. Not enemy. Friendly uniforms. A recon team, flanking wide from the ridgeline, weapons raised cautiously. One of them stepped forward, a young lieutenant barely older than Harris, who stared at Wally like he'd seen a ghost. "Sir, are you Grayback?" Wally nodded once. The lieutenant turned to the others. "He did it. He got in." The respect in the young man's voice wasn't loud, but it rang deeper than any salute. They helped them both into the chopper when it arrived, a UH-60 streaking low through the sky, its rotors scattering dust as medics reached down to pull Harris aboard. Wally hesitated at the edge, looking back toward the base, still glowing faintly against the pre-dawn sky, smoke curling up like a signal to the heavens. "Did we stop the strike?" he asked the lieutenant. The kid nodded. "The drones went dead after the explosion. Intel says it saved over 100 people in that village." Wally climbed aboard, settled into the seat, and felt the rumble as the bird lifted into the sky. It wasn't until they were 30 minutes out that Harris leaned over and asked, "Why'd you do it?" "No one even ordered you to go in." Wally looked out the window, watching the desert pass beneath them like a sea of memory. "Because I could," he said. "Because they never see us coming." Back at base, the brass didn't throw him a parade, didn't even mention his name in the press release, but among the boots on the ground, his story spread like fire through dry grass. The old man who crawled through sand and smoke, who tore the eyes out of the enemy while others hesitated. Harris stayed in the service after that, transferred to a tactical support unit, and every year he sent Wally a Christmas card with a simple line, "You showed me how to fight without firing a shot." As for Wally, he returned home eventually, not to medals or banners but to the quiet porch of his Montana cabin, where he drank black coffee each morning and watched the sun rise without fear. His knees still ached, his hands still bore the calluses of 100 forgotten days, but his heart was lighter. Not because he was a hero, but because, when the world thought he was done, he'd stood up and proved that age wasn't weakness, it was sharpened steel. And somewhere in a locked drawer, beneath the folded flag from his wife's funeral, he kept the old toolkit that had once helped him change the course of a war. A reminder that the right hands, no matter how weathered, could still bend fate. If this story of resilience and wisdom inspired you, share your thoughts below. How would you face such a challenge? What lessons from your life echo Wally's quiet courage?